All right, good morning, everybody. My name's Anthony Vitnell, and I'm a Microsoft Lync lead for Dimension Data here in the Americas. And I want to talk to you today about how to deploy Lync Voice on a global scale and be successful. And for those of you that just walked into the room, I just want to put a little caveat again. Unfortunately, there was a mix-up with the categorization of this session. It's not actually a level 400 session. It's probably more of a 200-300 session. So I'd much rather you pick another session rather than give me a bad review, because my green card application is dependent upon me getting good reviews here. So I've got some Skype cards that I need to give out, so I might just ask a question while we're letting some people get in. Can anybody guess what country I'm from? Nope, close? All righty, right here. Can anybody guess what city I'm from? Sydney, right here. All righty, good stuff. Enjoy. So in what I do, I spend a lot of time working with clients that I see continuing to make the same mistakes. Looking at deploying Lync Voice, but just not coming at it with the right approach, and trying to just pilot and do little piecemeals and bits and pieces here and there, and I get frustrated, because a lot of my time is trying to help educate people on how to approach this correctly to be successful. So what I'm going to talk through today is what I spend my life doing with customers around helping them understand what's going to be required to go from start to finish and be successful from a global Lync Voice deployment. So who is Dimension Data? We just need to put a little bit of the sales slide in here. So in 2013, Microsoft awarded us the Communications Partner of the Year globally, which was recognition of the work that we've been doing with our clients around designing, deploying global Lync Voice solutions, and also our managed and support services that we offer. We also have just recently launched our public and private cloud-hosted Lync. So that is an offering whereby, unlike Office 365, where there's no PSTN, there's no real voice capabilities, we can offer the per user per month consumption model with on-site SBAs and things like that to do a full PBX replacement as well. We've made a really big investment in certified Lync Masters. And we've got more Lync Masters than any organization outside of Microsoft, and unfortunately they discontinued that program. So we've got a lot of people internally that were gearing up to go through that, so we're really hoping that they will... there's a couple of seats down the front here, guys, if anybody wants to try and squeeze in. But so, from a capabilities perspective, we've deployed about 1.5 million seats of Lync globally, and of that, about 40% is enterprise voice, and that percentage and ratio is increasing. Over the last 18 months, we've seen explosive growth from PBX replacement and Lync Voice deployments as the product's matured and the market is now ready for that. So just a quick show of hands in the room. Who here is looking at deploying Lync Voice or is in the process of deploying Lync as a PBX platform? Okay, perfect. And are you guys looking at that with 2013 or 2010? 2013? Awesome. Okay, so I've sort of broken it up into three kind of categories that I'm going to, I've lumped together some of my brain dump and, the things that I think are important to share with you today into sort of three categories. So planning, I'm going to spend a decent amount of time on that because that's really the key to being successful here. I just spend some time on strategy, and then a little bit about technology. But again, as I said, it's not a level 400 session, so we're not going to get down into the bits and bytes of how to configure gateways and what the protocols are and things like that. But we're going to talk about the strategies and how to be successful with your deployments. This session is really going to be focused on PBX replacement. 2 years ago, we were all looking at integration and how do we make Cisco or Avaya work with Lync, things like RCC and SIP trunking so that we can send calls back and forth. But now where we're at and where the market has matured to, people are looking at PBX replacement and people are out there doing it and being successful. So I'm going to spend my time predominantly focusing on PBX replacement, while some of these methodologies, you can apply to, integration, but that's the train of thought that I'm going to be going down. So the most important thing from a planning perspective around global Lync Voice rollouts is your site survey. So this is, where you send resources out to site, or you have resources there, and you document what you have today. This is something that people often overlook, and they maybe do a dump out of what's in the current PBX for the number of analog lines and the number of phones, and they use that for their planning. But if you don't have somebody out there to look at and say, okay, what's the cabling like? We're going to rip out analog phones, and we're going to be putting in Lync phones, but do we have Cat5, Cat6 cabling there? The analog punch-down blocks. Do we need to recable the analog so that we can, deploy the Sonos or the audio codes gateways from, to terminate those analog trunk lines? From a PBX perspective, we need to look at things like the configurations and protocols. Some of the gateways out there don't support all of the carrier protocols, so you may make your selection of the gateway based on the understanding of whether you're using NFAS, NI2, etc. Counting the devices, because if you do a dump out of your PBX, it's probably going to have phones that were configured 20 years ago. So walking the floor and actually understanding how many phones do you have out there, how many conference room phones, how many common area phones, how many wall mount kits do you need, so that you can develop your plan effectively. Floor plans are really helpful here if you have those available, because you may be flying somebody in to go and do this site survey for you. And if they don't know, how many buildings, how many floors, they may go and come back and say they did the site survey correctly for you, but you realize they missed a floor, missed a building in the campus. So that's always helpful. Looking at the network. So I've seen this, unfortunately, a couple of times where customers have said, yep, I've got PoE and there's enough PoE. We come in on the weekend, we deploy phones, they boot up on the weekend. Everything's great, all the testing's fine. Come Monday morning, people come in and plug in their laptops and the power drain on the switches, then phones start turning off. So you really need to look at, just because you have PoE doesn't mean you have enough capacity from a power draw perspective for all of the phones. So you really need to look at that and actually map that out based on the type of phone you're using, because they all have different power draws. And then you need to look at how that's going to impact your UPS as well. Because the idea of a UPS is that if power is lost to the building, services stay up, right? So that people can keep working. You're adding in a lot of extra power draw onto these PoE switches by having thousands of phones hanging off. So that may impact the longevity of your UPS and your DR and your resiliency plan there. It's also important to look at the rack space. We're going to be deploying a gateway, but is there room in the rack? Is there going to be room? Do we need to run a T1 extension cable? And if so, it's best to know those up front, because it's different pinouts. You can't just grab a standard T1 cable or a standard T1 crossover cable to plug into your demarc point. You may have to have a specific cable made up. And these sound like silly little things, but these are things that trip you up. Because you get on site, you're trying to do a migration, you plug it in, you realize you've got the wrong cable. And then everybody's sitting there pulling their hair out, going crazy, trying to find a crimping tool and to create the appropriate cables. So getting this done up front for all of your sites is really important, because it's going to help drive your planning and identifying any other, like whether there's a network refresh required, whether there's any other external things that you haven't thought about that is going to impact how you deploy Lync Voice at these sites. It's also really important to talk to the key people on that site. So the reception team and the executive admins are the most important people. I've got lots of horror stories to tell about them, and one of them I'll talk about on a later slide. But I've got a picture here. I went and physically did a site survey for one of my clients, and this was the phone that I found on reception. Big, old, clunky thing. And talking to the reception team, this is how they live and breathe. They don't want anything to change. They want this exact same functionality moving forward. But Lync doesn't have that. Lync, yes, some of the new phones have got some expansion modules, but the way those expansion modules work is different to the way this Avaya set works. So we've got some, at that particular customer, we had some challenges before we started, but we were able to plan for those rather than get there on migration night, put a phone on the desk, and then have the receptionist not able to function the next day. The physical security team. I had one particular client, they said, no, we don't need E911, nothing special happens with 911. We said, okay, but we're just going to check when we do the site survey. So we went and met with the physical security team and said, what happens when somebody dials 911? And they said, well, when they dial 911, we at security, we get an announcement come through on the security phone so that we can then pick up that phone and listen in and monitor what's happening and then react to the situation, so the physical security team is aware of it. So had we just listened to what our client had told us, we wouldn't have come up with a solution for that, and then there would have been, emergency services is obviously very important, so that would have been a big challenge for us. We came up with a creative solution, so whereby we were able to put a PC in the security office, because within Lync you can set an IM notification so that it sends an IM to somebody when there is a emergency services call. So we set up a PC with set really loud speakers so that when that 911 call went out, there was like an alarm bell going off, so the security team knew to action that. But again, had we not spoken to them, we wouldn't have known that, and then we wouldn't have addressed that situation before we got on site to do the deployment. Call boxes, elevator phones, these kinds of things. Depending, if you own the building, it's a little bit different to when you've just got a floor, right? Oftentimes, like elevator phones are handled by the building, but if you own the building, then you need to understand how you're going to integrate that into your Lync environment as well. It's really, really important to talk to the contact center team, even if it's just a small hunt group, because everybody says, oh, I don't have my requirements for call center or response groups or hunt groups is very basic. And that's fine. Lync has some good stuff out of the box, but it doesn't have everything. And unless you talk to the contact center team or the people that are managing those queues, you don't understand whether Lync can actually match to that. Again, finding out up front is a lot better than coming on migration day and finding out that you've got to go and get a third-party contact center solution to meet their requirements. So time and time again, I come in after Microsoft. I'm sorry, Microsoft, if you're in the room. That's done a sales pitch to a client and said, you don't need handsets, put a headset on everybody's desk. It's going to save you all sorts of money. Your ROI is going to be amazing. And then I come in and then have to have the reality conversation with them to say that headsets are cool. Some organizations that we work with, like technology-based companies, we're seeing them be successful going the headset-only route. But your traditional office-based worker wants a phone. And not just that, but when you look at the life expectancy of the device, who wants a second-hand headset, right? Are you going to take a headset back from somebody when they leave the organization, put some spray and wipe on it, and then give it to the next person? I mean, I wouldn't want that. And not only that, they get lost, cables get broken. They don't last. Like, if you look at the existing PBX phones out there, you've probably had them for 5, 10 years, right? It's pretty standard. Some of them may fail, but the overall lifespan you can expect is greater than 5 years. A headset's not going to last you 5 years. I go through them on a weekly/monthly basis, and thankfully Java and Plantronics are really kind and keep providing them to me, but I lose them, break them. So it's important to understand, the life expectancy and what you're expecting to do, so that you don't, buy 10,000 headsets and then realize you need 8,000 phones as well, because not everybody's going to accept a headset model. So about 18 months ago, Microsoft introduced the qualified for Lync devices. So prior to that, the only real phones out there were the Lync optimized phones, which run Communicator Phone Edition. Really good phones. Polycom makes them, Astra, I think HP. There's a few different vendors that make that, different devices that run that same operating system. But nothing's really changed in that operating system since they were launched. There's been some bug fixes, some minor tweaks. They introduced music on hold on the device, a few little things, but there's been no leaps and bounds, that they've moved forward on those devices, introducing things like boss admin, shared line appearances, and things like that. So about 12, 18 months ago, the Qualified for Lync program came out, and vendors like Polycom with their VVX range, Snome, Audio Codes now have some phones, and there's a few other vendors whereby they own the device, they own the software, and using the Qualified for Lync program, they register and interact with Lync. The difference is the operating system's owned and managed by that manufacturer, which is a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is they can innovate and enhance and add functionality. So Snome and VVX have got, shared line appearances, paging, intercom, these traditional telephony features that were lacking in the optimized devices. But the roadmap is different. Different vendors have different roadmaps, different features, functionality, but it's certainly, my recommendation to my clients that are looking at making the move to Lync Voice is to look at the qualified devices, because I think you're going to get a lot longer lifespan out of it. I haven't seen anything from Microsoft around them deprecating or the optimized devices going away, but if I look back to the Tanjay, the OCS, Lync Phone Edition device, the Tanjay or the CX700 or 7000, that's still there. There's still software updates for that to work with Lync 2013, but nothing's changed. And I expect the same may happen with the, the CX600 type devices. So I'd look at the qualifieds moving forward. Now, this is just a quick slide that sort of compares. This isn't all of the features. This is just a few of the key ones. And I've mentioned them: boss admin, shared line appearance, intercom and paging. These were the ones that Microsoft got beaten up for the most in terms of not having, because I'm working with one of my clients, and they are a law firm, and 80% of their organization need shared line appearances. So it just was not an option to use the CX devices. The attendant console and the Lync console just doesn't really, although Microsoft's trying to drive people to the software-based approach, as I said, I do a lot of the site surveys and get a feel for what my clients need. And this particular organization, I went around and met with their key legal counsel, some of the executives, and some of their executive assistants. And the thought of touching a PC for them to manage their boss's calls it was not going to happen. There's absolutely no chance. So that's really why you need to look at these devices. And something that's really cool that they have that the CX phones don't have is better together over Ethernet. And I'm sure you've heard about this and seen this, but this is really cool in that to tether the desktop to the phone, you don't need that USB cable anymore. However, it introduces some other challenges we'll talk about later around you now have to deploy better together over Ethernet software on your clients. And that introduces some extra challenges as well. So remember the days when Microsoft said you don't need QoS for OCS? We've got an adaptive codec. You don't need QoS. It'll just work over the internet. I found that quite funny. But the reality is you can't deploy an enterprise-grade telephony system without QoS. This picture on the left is a client of mine that tried to, they didn't believe me. So they were having issues deploying QoS. They had some constraints, and they had to get Lync Voice running. So they said, you know what, we're just going to put it out there. We've got big pipes. We don't think it's going to be an issue. I spoke to the CIO, and I begged and pleaded, and he said, nope, we have to do it. It has to be deployed. It's hard to see there, but you see down the bottom, you'll see that the blue color, those are the good calls. The red, the green, and the purple are fair, poor, and unacceptable. So it's pretty easy to see that more than 95% of the calls were either poor, unacceptable, or fair, which is, and expectedly they had all sorts of issues. And it wasn't bandwidth. They had big pipes, but there was just competing for other traffic on the environment. So, I'll say it once, I'll say it twice. Don't forget about the network. It's the most important element. If you don't do it, you're going to run into issues like this. And when your system goes live and people have bad experience, they're going to remember that. Even when you fix it, doesn't remember. Lync is always going to be that phone system that has bad quality, and there was choppy, garbled audio and things like that. Another interesting thing that I ran into at one of my clients, and so now we make sure that we check this as part of our deployments, is they had a site that when the WAN link went down after 10 minutes, there was a survivable branch appliance, so the phones would register there and everything would work in the survivable mode. It was all good. But after about 10, 15 minutes, the phones would just go offline. And we're all like, what the heck, what's going on? We're pulling our hair out, looking at the SBA, saying, what's wrong here? Turned out the DHCP renewal time was set to like 10 minutes. So after 10 minutes, the phones were trying to renew, weren't getting an IP address, and then were releasing and just rebooting. So simple little thing like that was causing a big outage. So it's just another thing that we've added into our checklist, and something, it's just something to check, because these are the silly little things that can trip you up. And then, especially in a failure situation, you don't want to find out the hard way that you didn't have the right timers. When you're looking at sizing your bandwidth, there's some really good tools from Microsoft out there around, building, personas and modeling out what the expected traffic is. You can never get it perfect because, you're switching from one system to another. There's going to be, there's some element of finger in the air when you're working through those. So unfortunately, you'll never get it right first time, but you want to make sure that you go through the exercise and then monitor that. And make sure you've got QoS end to end. So from the desktop or the phone right the way through to the server. And you also need to be very careful around what your Q slot, your gold class is going to be, or your EFQ from your carrier, because that's expensive. right? But you need to make sure that you go to Verizon, AT&T, or whomever is your carrier, and you get the appropriate sized EF or gold class queue, because I think it's Verizon or AT&T, I can't remember which one it is, but when the default, when the queue is exceeded, it actually starts, it doesn't do best effort, it does like worst effort. So when you go over that queue that you've specified, if you say I need 2 megs of gold class, prioritized voice traffic, and you go to 2.5, I don't know why, even when there's sufficient bandwidth, but once it goes over, it drops it to worst effort. It doesn't even go to best effort, and those over that pipe just start to be absolutely terrible quality, even if you have the bandwidth. So you need to make sure end-to-end that you size that appropriately. So this sort of falls back to the site survey, but call handlers and auto attendants, they're called different things in different systems, but there's generally going to be a lot of them out there. And when you're doing your site survey, you want to go through and you want to document what you have today. The reason being, it's not a one-to-one move from Avaya or Cisco over to Lync. Some of the Exchange UM system prompts you can't change. Some of the default numbers, for the DTMF tones, you cannot change. So you need to understand, what's on each recording, and it's quite a laborious task, but you need to either have somebody document that or go through and listen and confirm that those digits are not going to conflict when you move that over. Again, doing this up front is important, because if you need to re-record any of those prompts, then you need to go to your marketing team, and they need to get whoever's got the loud booming voice that does your voiceovers and stuff, and that can take some time as well. An example customer they had 1,500 users. It was a 20-year-old PBX. There was 300 call handlers. Now that's massive, and a lot of them were obsolete, and it was really, really hard for us to work out what was not being used, because some of them had been configured 15 years ago. And so we had to go back through reams and reams of call logs, trying to understand what numbers and what call handlers had actually been called. So again, in this planning piece, trying to consolidate and get rid of, you don't want to just take all 300 across, because then you're just moving the junk from one system to another. So you want to make sure that you go through that exercise and clean that up. Another challenging one is common area phones and non-user phones. So Lync, as we all know, it associates to your user account, right? So if they're, for common area phones, they don't get a user account, they get like a contact object, whereby it allows that phone to log in with PIN authentication. But it doesn't get the full suite of services. A common area phone cannot have voicemail. Where's this a problem? A number of my clients, and as some of you people in the room may have this, where you have third-party people come on site, and maybe they're a dedicated person, they've got a desk, and they need voicemail, but they're not an employee. So how are you going to give them voicemail? And you'll have to work with your security team to see if you can get disabled user accounts with voicemail set up so that you can still provide that service. At a couple of my clients, this was really, really challenging, and it delayed the migrations until we could get the security team to find a middle ground, because it wasn't an option to give them no voicemail, and it wasn't an option to give them a user account. So it was very, very challenging. So something that you need to think about. Again, as you're doing your site survey, these are the kind of elements that you understand, so you know how to plan for that when it comes time to deployment. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and start talking about some strategy. By all means, if anybody has questions along the way, please feel free to throw your hand up. I've got some more Skype cards here for those of you that are interested. So something that I see time and time again with clients is, not taking the right approach here. Like, they know that they want to roll out 20 sites, 30 sites, but they want to just do one at a time. All right, and that's fine, but in terms of understanding your ROI or the value that you can get, the quicker you get from multiple systems to one, the better in terms of your cost savings opportunities. So you've got to be careful not to get caught in the pilot trap. I see this happen, time and time again. You put a pilot in, and it's easy to put a pilot in, but you never fully deploy a pilot. You don't dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and it never works perfectly. And then, unfortunately, what happens is the pilot starts growing. You go from 10 users, and before you know it, you're at 500 pilot users, but the system's not ready for 500 users, and you start running into all sorts of challenges. So, what we looked at on the right-hand side, this is just an example of, a deployment workbook that we do, whereby we use a T-minus schedule, right? If you're looking at, how many people here have got multiple sites? You guys, yeah, good portion. So, we look at building out the complete, project plan, but then we summarize that in this deployment workbook with the T-minus schedule. So we know that a site survey needs to be completed 60 days before a site's migrated. Hardware needs to be ordered 45 days. All of these checkpoints, and then it's green, red, and so we can see and be tracking that. And then we might do a site survey at a site, realize it needs a network upgrade, so then we readjust, move that along, so that we can have a constant flow of activities, to ensure success to get from start to finish. Also, when doing your planning, think about the international challenges and concerns. Like India is always a tough one, Brazil, Russia, those are some of the key challenging countries. Thinking about local language support as well. If you're developing training material, what languages and what countries are you in? Do you need to have that translated into Spanish, French, or whatever? Or is English going to be, is your organization going to allow for training just in English? Again, thinking about these things up front means that you're prepared that when you hit that site, you can be successful. And I always see people forget about this last piece, decommission. That's when the fun is, like taking the sledgehammer, like they're doing out in the expo hall, getting rid of the old kit. But it's important to plan for that, because you might get to the end, and if you're not sure that you've got everything off it, you've fully decommissioned it, and you don't have somebody, plan to come in and take it away, right? Because some of these old PBXs take up, like half of this room, right? So it's not just something you can throw out the trash. You may have to have somebody come in with, some big trucks, and there may be a cost associated to that. But there also may be residual value. So, don't just look at throwing it out. You'll get pennies on the dollar, but you still may be able to get somebody to come in for free, take it away, and give you back some money for your troubles. As well as the same thing with your handsets. When you remove those off the desk, you may be able to get some residual value there as well. So time and time again, I get my clients saying, we want to move to SIP trunking, we want to do Lync voice, we want to do it quick, let's make it happen. And my caution is, SIP trunking's great, there's lots of cost savings, but it's a project on its own, right? Deploying SIP trunking and being successful should not be paired together with Lync, because there's a lot of complexities and a lot of challenges. So I would suggest move to SIP trunking first, or closely after your migration to Lync. And the reason for that is on day one, when users come in and they're having bad quality audio or issues or something like that, do you want to be pulling your hair out saying, is it the carrier, is it the MPLS circuit, is it the QoS from the SIP trunking provider, or is it the Lync solution? It's just too many moving parts, and when you look at your risk profile, I would typically recommend that you, depending upon your infrastructure and your architecture, either move to SIP trunking first, or migrate to Lync, and then 1 week or 2 weeks later, do the back-end move to SIP trunking. And a SIP trunking move, the users won't see. Short question up the back?
Yeah, so you'd say it would be a good idea to maybe terminate the PRIs, so like the gateway?
So
what I recommend to my customers a lot of times is to terminate, right, the traditional stuff maybe upstream from the PBX.
yes, so the question was around, is there a recommendation to terminate the PRIs upstream from the PBX? And that's certainly an option, and later on I'll talk about some of those, the actual technology strategies. But the key is just making sure they're separate migration events. And the SIP trunking move, users don't know about it if you do it right. So it's not a user impacting, you generally don't need to put resources on site for that if you do things right. Small to medium sites, I generally recommend, a long time ago everybody wanted to do this coexistence and sort of test the waters and dip their toe in and make the PBX, the existing PBX talk to Lync and Lync talk to the PBX. And while that could be done, it introduced extra cost from the sizing of your gateways and complexity, because you're making changes on the existing PBX. So now my recommended approach is, a single migration event for the small to medium sites, so that you come in on an evening or a weekend and get phones out on the desk, get the PRIs moved over or SIP trunk, so that at the end of that, the PBX is ready to be turned off. Question? Sure. So the question was, do we recommend like a central big SIP trunking infrastructure or local SIP trunks in each site or each country? And in the US, it's pretty common to centralize SIP trunking and have like a big SBC in your core because we have good network pipes. It's a single carrier. In Europe and things like that, and specifically Asia, it's a bit more challenging because network, the US is very lucky at the size of our pipes and the cost of our bandwidth. So in Europe and Asia, I found it a little bit more tricky. There's not necessarily every country you can centralize. We've got some clients that are doing both. They're delivering SIP trunk directly to the branch because they want to have local survivability as well. So it's sort of, there isn't a one-size-fits-all in terms of that approach. Good question. So do you get a dedicated connection for the SIP trunk? So I see some customers doing that and bringing it in over their MPLS circuit. Dimension Data, for example, we use a second-tier provider that delivers it over the internet for us. We made that decision 3 or 4 years ago. We haven't looked back from it. We've been really, really successful. We haven't had any call quality issues or anything. But I'm seeing a lot of the larger kind of organizations that I work with that are scared about SIP trunking to start with. They feel that that's extra risk to deliver the voice services over the internet, and so they opt to bring it in either over a dedicated MPLS circuit or over their existing MPLS network. Sure.
In your path there, do you migrate the larger sites or the smaller sites first?
It's different with each. Sorry, the question was, do we migrate the smaller sites first or the larger sites? And it's different for every client, and it depends. Oftentimes we would like to. I think it's a path of least resistance and least risk to do some pilots. You want to do some pilot sites because as much as any integrator can come in and bring their expertise, there's just things that are going to be specific to each organization that are kinks that need to be worked through. So my recommendation wouldn't be to, first migration event be 2,000 handsets, because if something goes wrong, you've got 2,000 people that are upset. In that instance, I see a lot of people starting with, starting with the pilot, maybe being the technology people, but you've got to be careful. Don't pilot technology people because they're more accepting of issues. You need to pilot your real users. So generally we'd like to pick a couple of small sites to do the full start to finish migration event and work through any of the kinks and then do a lessons learnt. So don't schedule your migration that you do, France this week and in 2 weeks' time you're going to do Argentina. You want to have some time in between to iron out any of the kinks that you may find, do a lessons learned to debrief and a dump, and improve before you go after the next set of sites.
So we typically deploy our SIP trunks a couple of weeks before we go live, and then that lets us test for a few weeks. I mean, we do bias against something like that.
No, certainly not. If you've got the capacity to do that, if you've got the capacity to deploy your SIP trunks ahead of time, are you saying that you do a SIP trunking move at the same time as a Lync voice move? You do? I mean, it's certainly something you can do. I'm risk averse for that, so I like to break that out, especially for the larger sites, because I've seen things go wrong, and the key to success I've found and we've found is to minimize the areas of risk that can go wrong, and so that's why we look to break those into 2 events.
I mean, it's 2 weeks prior, the SIP trunk's live, but we test numbers, and then we just stress test, prove it out, and then we can port on the go live date.
If you've got the ability to do that and to stress test, because the key is making sure that it is operational and it is functional for your migration event. So that's certainly an option that you can.
Kind of answer what he's saying. I see some customers that use temporary numbers and hairpin them.
Yep.
Right? So that way there's no, from a risk perspective, right, the number porting and everything that they would have to do that way, there's a potential for risk with the port.
Yeah.
So you can use temporary numbers and hairpin them, right, and to the real number, and then when you migrate over, you port over, you just take that block of numbers back.
Yeah,
Right?
definitely.
So and it's done in the background so that the end user doesn't feel anything.
And that's the thing. The SIP trunking move is users don't see that. So this is just the approach that I typically take. But I'm not saying I'm right in all circumstances. There are definitely opportunities where you can do that. But just so long as you're able to do the stress testing and ensure that day one you're not going to run into any issues, then you can set yourself up for success.
Well, the things that you're saying about risk, that's most of the time for any type of decision that lowers the risk, right? Because like what you're saying, I'm a PFD, so
Yeah.
I see all the bad deployments, and most of the time the pain of the initial deployment, especially on the voice side, is what you say, the end users have a wrong number.
They do. It's unfortunate.
C-level people have a wrong number.
Yeah.
Signing checks that are backiness have a wrong number.
Exactly. So whatever we can do to be successful and minimize that disruption is the key, because unfortunately I've come in after clients have done their own deployment and they've had that bad day one experience, and you just can't get back from that. You never do. 10 years later they'll be saying that Lync system has got bad quality audio, but you haven't had a bad call in 10 years, but they're still going to remember that. So again, with doing the small to medium sites in a single migration event, it means you can minimize travel to site, right? Because if it's in Argentina or Brazil, or you've got to fly people in, if you can do it in one event, that can minimize the number of trips and your travel costs. So typically that's the way that we look to approach things. But the larger sites, you have to break that up. We have, for some clients, done 10,000 handsets in a single weekend. It's a massive, massive orchestration, and it takes about 3 months worth of planning to be able to do that. It can be done, but it's not typical. You'd sort of integrate and set that up so that you do a floor, maybe. Our typical run rate is about 500 handsets a week. We try to average it around 2,000 for our larger deployments, so that we've found that to be a pretty successful number in terms of not having burnout of our resources or our customers' resources. So again, talking about keeping the users happy, training and adoption is really, really important here. When I go around and I do site surveys and I interview the executive admins and things like that, the key message that I get back is it's not that the phone system doesn't work, it's that they don't know how to use it. The key thing they're saying is, I don't know how to transfer, I don't know how to do a directory lookup. And I have to come back and I have to tell my client, I'm like, if we just train them on this system, then they might be happy, right? Because it's just that they don't know how to do these tasks. It's not that the phone can't do it. So we don't want the same thing to happen with Lync, especially considering how different it is. So, building your training program is really, really important. So there's some awesome stuff from Microsoft. There's the Rollout and Adoption Success Kit, which has got a plethora of documents, templates, PowerPoints, training, and things like that you can take and customize. Do like a dedicated page on your internet portal that you send everybody to. Do it. We at Dimension Data, when we deployed OCS, we did a really big marketing campaign internally, and that's those pictures on the right-hand side. We called it integrated collaboration, just to be different, but that was because we were integrating voice, video, and Lync, and it was OCS, so all of the conferencing modalities. And we created the buzz. We got buy-in from our executive team, so the CEO and the CIO were sort of pushing this down on the organization and enforcing people to use it. And we were really successful with that campaign and our adoption. And then we measured. We had measurement tools as well. So we tracked, the end user adoption through surveys. We tracked who attended training. And given that we had our executives pushing down upon this, we had about a 98% attendance rate to training. I even attended the user training. That was because there was so much emphasis from our senior leadership that we had to attend the training. We got a really good success rate, and then that translates to lower support costs and more satisfied users. So whatever you can do to create that buzz and to get more people to training is something that I would highly recommend.
Do you have any? Does he have like any videos or anything? Is that more common now?
So the Rollout and Adoption Success Kit, which I've got the link to at the bottom, that has a number of videos in the training materials. In 2010, it was all PowerPoint slides. Now with 2013, the PowerPoint slides have an embedded video in them. And there's actually some third-party companies that we work with that do some CBT-based, like online self-paced training, and they can customize that to your environment and use your own screenshots and things. So I've had some clients that have used that and been really successful as well. But a good first start is the Rollout and Adoption Success Kit. It's got things like emails to communicate out to the users to let them know what's coming. It's got the training stuff. It's even got some tools for enabling your help desk, your service desk team around how to understand, what are going to be some of the common tickets and common support issues. Really, really powerful tool. Question up the back.
Yeah, just to amplify what you're saying, again, being on the front lines, this almost never gets done, right? So we have customers that ignore this piece, and when you're talking about on the adoption side, this position, and they're all Mac. And they hate Microsoft.
Yeah.
So they are dragging their feet, doing everything that they can to trip up. And so the rest of the company is on board, just this one office is making their life miserable.
Yeah, and we see that. We have some clients with Macs as well, and so we have training, the key to success is getting them on board, right? We can do everything right with the technology. We can deploy a 5.9 system, high available, SIP trunking cost savings, but if users, I've got these little pictures, I've seen clients like this, ready to, I had the CEO's executive admin from one of my clients walk in. She didn't attend the training, by the way. She walked into the CEO's office and said, if I have to use this bleep Lync system, I'm going to quit. She didn't attend the training. We sent people on site to do the high touch because those are the kind of people, we knew this was a particular lady that with every rollout always had an issue. Right? We all know we've got those guys and girls out there that no matter what, they're not going to be happy. So we tried to do that high touch. She wouldn't make herself available, and it was unfortunate that we had the CEO calling up the CIO, who was then calling up. Everybody was getting beaten up down the line. But this is really, really important to being successful. When you're looking at online training and inviting them to join sessions, it's unfortunate, but trying to do your training with Lync conferencing kind of doesn't work. You have to look at like WebEx or something because you can't show how to join a meeting and how to join a conference call when you're sharing. So there's just one thing to think about. We typically use WebEx or some other system to show or the existing system that's being replaced to do that training so that the trainer can actually show all of the capabilities. And also you need to think about the costs of that as well. Because if you're going to have a couple of thousand people dialing in, PSTN charges, concurrency rates and things like that, you need to think about. So I talked a lot about day one, what happened, and being successful day one. So, we've adopted an approach, and you'll find information about this in the rollout and adoption success kit about hypercare. So different people call it different things, but basically it's people in really ugly, bright-colored T-shirts on site on the day of the migration event. If you walk around here, you see everybody in a bright red shirt. Whenever you got a question, where's my session, you go to them, right? It's just easy. We use like bright dimension data green so that the people are scattered around the floor. And the feedback that we get is, we've had some executives come up and say, this is great. All of my staff was able to find who they needed and get that issue resolved, right there and then on day one, rather than having to log a ticket. And if their phone's not working, how do they call the help desk, right? And up the top here, this is an example from one of my client deployments that we did recently. We actually track all of the issues. And it may be a little bit hard to see, but I'll talk through, what some of those categories are. So each issue that's resolved, we track the issue so that we can do the lessons learned and make sure we don't have that issue at the next site. This particular client, the big blue on the right-hand side that you probably can't see, unfortunately, that was BTOE issues. Better together over Ethernet. I mentioned there's an extra software push that you need for better together over Ethernet. Unfortunately, the desktop team had said, yep, that building is all rolled out. It's been successful. No worries. We get there on sites, and because people take their laptops home and things like that, we placed all the phones over the evening. They came in Monday morning, and nearly 40% of the phones of the PCs didn't get the push from System Center. So they didn't have the BTOE software, so they couldn't log in and authenticate to the phones, and it was quite ugly. We had the team in green running around with USB sticks, running the software around doing manual installs. That was a lesson learnt that we will double, triple check to make sure that the System Center push is successful before we go to the next site. There's other things here like network patching, replacing phones, people wanting to select a different headset. And if you capture and track these things, you can do the debrief and say, okay, how do we make sure that we reduce that for the next site? And it's really powerful. We did an executive meeting, with the clients, and having that data to say, this is what went well and what went wrong was really powerful. Make sure you train not just the floor walkers, but your service desk. As I said, there's some stuff in the rollout and adoption success kit that's a good start, but it's not enough. They need to, first call resolution is important in anything, right? And oftentimes, many of our clients, they outsource their service desk, right? I've got a couple of clients that outsource to IBM, and they do a follow the sun global kind of thing. So there was a number of people that we had to train so that they could get that first call resolution. And we created, we took what Microsoft had in the rollout and adoption success kit, and then we built on top of that and added to that so that when a call came in, they had, like a workflow of, how to resolve those issues first call. And that's, again, really, really important for day one, but also, moving forward. You want to have your service desk able to resolve these issues before they get escalated to, to your Lync admins. And don't forget about day two. So, in the ROI session or the TEI session that I did earlier this morning, we talked about, the areas that some people forget about when it comes to building out the business justification for Lync. They think they can turn off their Avaya and replace that support contract, but you still may need to have a support contract for Lync. But if you're doing internal support, make sure your guys are trained. Trained on Lync, trained on whichever platform you choose for your gateways, whether it's Sonos, whether it's Oracle Acme Packets, whether it's audio codes. Your internal staff needs to be able to support that and have the support contracts to escalate into those vendors and know how to do that. Also, from a Lync perspective, you need to make sure that you either have Premier support for Lync, as part of your contract, or you leverage a Premier support partner such as Dimension Data, whereby we place a wrapper and we're the one throat to choke for all of those support calls. A number of our clients were actually doing, day two support and management for. So, but again, it's important if you are using a third party to support and manage your environment that service is activated before you start migrating users. Because if they're not monitoring, managing that environment, and you start putting users out, then it can introduce some challenges on day two. So this is the fun world that we live in, supporting voice users that are now no longer in our network. We've all probably been sitting here making calls from the Wi-Fi network in this facility. We always do it from, whenever we check into a hotel, we get in, we start making voice calls and things like that. We talked about the importance of QoS on the internal network and those poor quality calls that client had. You don't manage the internet. How do we factor this in? The value prop is, hey, you can work anywhere, you can make calls from home, but what do we do when there's problems? And it's a big challenge. Some of the key things that I see time and time again is kids on Xbox, families streaming, streaming from Netflix, and people not knowing, what's going on. The poor wireless connectivity. I live in a high-rise apartment in Miami, and there's 600 units, and everyone's got a wireless access point, right? And there's only so many channels of wireless, right? And they try to, pick the right channel so there's no overlap. But when there's such a dense population of people with wireless access points, I have terrible wireless consistency. So I personally, as the Lync guy, was having bad voice calls whenever I used wireless in my home. Thankfully, it was pre-wired for Ethernet, so I just had to patch in some ports. But the average user is going to go home, connect on wireless, and then they're going to be reporting, oh, well, this stinks, and they're going to be logging tickets with your help desk. So you need to have, a plan for how you're going to address that. You can't just say it's not supported, good luck, because as soon as an executive calls up, you're going to be supporting them. So some recommendations that I have is, there are some wireless routers, gateways out there now that actually do prioritization of traffic. Now, it's not QoS because it's not going to be end-to-end, right? You don't own the internet pipe, but you can prioritize it, leaving your network above Netflix or above the Xbox traffic. So at least in terms of your bandwidth, it's going out prioritized a little bit further ahead. It's really important to educate your users, but again, education is one thing, and it's important to train on this, but still not everybody's going to attend. You're still going to have a plan for how you remedy this. This tool here, the Trip tool, I don't know whether any of you have seen it, but this is awesome. It's a tool that Microsoft created for testing bandwidth and connectivity with Office 365. When you go to that link, there's different testing locations. There's one in North America, there's one in Singapore, a few different places around the world. And what it does is it pops up and runs this little Java-based app that runs a series of network tests, and then it gives you the results. So you can see here, this was actually my wireless connection at home. So you can see I had 24 megs of bandwidth down, 1 meg up, so I had plenty of capacity, but consistency and service and jitter was what was impacting me and causing me voice quality issues. So this is a real, building a dashboard or an internal website that points users to tools like this so they can diagnose it themselves. One of my clients, Holland and Knight, they were mentioning in their session, they actually created a little dashboard in their portal that does in the background some ping tests and things like that. And it will just give them a red or green response on their main portal to say whether you've got good enough connectivity. It's pretty rudimentary, but something like that can, we need to educate users that Lync is like a cell phone. Like how many times are we saying, oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? And we've come to expect and know that that's how cell phones are. So again, we need to educate them that that's what happens with Lync Voice as well. And Lync 2013 is now supported over wireless. I didn't know that it wasn't supported over wireless in 2010 until I saw this article come out to say that it was supported with 2013. I was like, really? Wow. But there's a really good white paper there that talks about all of the things you need to think about when you're deploying wireless in your environment. And I mentioned in my session earlier that I've got clients now that are going full wireless. So they're building new campuses, campus of the future, or workspace of the future. They've all got different names. And rather than running patch cables to all of the desks, they just put a good wireless infrastructure in. Everybody gets a laptop and a headset, and they save a lot of money on the cabling. But if you do that, make sure you follow the guidelines here so that you've got efficient wireless capacity to support all of that voice and video traffic that you're going to have. All right, I'm probably running out of time. I am getting close to it. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technology stuff now. So I'm just going to touch on a little bit. There's enough sessions around high availability and all of these things, but I want to just touch on a little bit around the sort of the approach that I take with my clients when looking at HA, DR, and things like that. And with Exchange, we need to talk about RTO and RPO. We don't care so much about, so RTO is recovery time objective, RPO is recovery point. Because we don't have data, it's not like email, we don't have to worry about the recovery point as much because it's really just call logs and things like that. It's really how quick can we get it back up. Out of the box, Lync 2013's got some really cool DR capabilities. There's some limitations to that, and specifically I'm going to talk about some of the branch limitations because the DR between data centers and pools and things like that's pretty neat, but what happens if your SBA in Argentina fails? What's your RTO? What's your expectation of the business as to how quickly you'll have voice services back up in that location? Yes, they'll fail back to the pool, and they'll probably still be able to make outbound calls, but what's going to happen to their inbound DIDs? You may be able to go to the carrier and have them forward them, but these are the sort of things you need to think about, and it can get quite complex, especially as you go to multiple countries. So this is just like a quick example of what it looks like. So you can build all your server infrastructure, so it's fully HA. You can fail from one site to the next and maybe have like a few seconds of downtime, and Lync 2013's done a really good job there. But the issues are around branch site SBAs and your PSTN connectivity. Again, in your central sites, you can use SIP trunking and have it terminating in multiple data centers. That's not an issue. It's out in that remote location where you've got 50 users and an obscure carrier, and so you're going to have some challenges there. This is Microsoft's branch resiliency recommendations. So they say, under 1,000 users, put an SBA. 1,000 to 2,000, it says 2 SBAs. And then over 2,000, put a standard edition or a survivable branch server. I don't really like this recommendation. First off, the 2 SBA option means that when you configure a user, you have to assign which SBA they go to. It's not, those are not resilient within themselves. So you assign users to SBA 1 or to SBA 2. So it's not really a full resilient option. And the very large branches, well, if you've got 2,000 users, that's not really a branch. That's like a HQ location. So you may need to look at a different approach there. Some of the challenges or considerations that we have is, here in the US, we're blessed with big pipes and the ability to have multiple connections, right? So I have a number of clients that made big investments in redundant network infrastructure. So they have 2 carriers, 2 lines out the building going different directions so that if one goes, it'll automatically fail over to the other. If you've made that investment and you've built resiliency into the network, it's probably because you're running line of business applications and there's revenue generating activities happening there. So is that sufficient also to provide your DR for your voice services? It may be. It's something to think about. You may not need to put a local gateway or an SBA in those sites. With Microsoft's recommendations around the branches, one thing to consider is all of your conferencing or your MCU traffic is coming back to the pools. So if you're trying to deploy an SBA in Amsterdam connecting back to the pool in North America, that means every time someone in Amsterdam does a conference, that voice traffic backhauls all the way back to North America. So you need to think about that. We've had clients that have chosen to make that decision that they don't want to put local pools in that region because there's only one site in EMEA, so they just disable conferencing for that site. That's a way to get around that because all of the voice services will stay local in and out through the PSTN on the local gateway, and you can just disable conferencing. Yes, you lose some of the functionality, but you save the cost of having to deploy another pool in an unmanaged data center. So SBA and PSTN redundancy. So I've got a couple of slides where we'll talk about this, but this is, the things we need to think about here is, let's say we go to Audio Codes or Sonos, we buy a gateway. What's their hardware replacement SLA? In some countries, you can get it down to as low as 4 hours on site, right, which is great, but that's not everywhere. And what happens if that gateway goes down and you're losing your inbound and outbound voice calling? What's the implication going to be of that to your business? So this is a very wordy slide. I'm just going to talk through it. You don't need to read it all. So this is a solution we came up with for one client whereby they had two SBAs, SBA 1, SBA 2 at that location. The two SBAs had one PRI each, and they were configured to load share traffic for in and outbound dialing across those PRIs, and the SBAs would talk to each other. In the event that one of the SBAs failed, we would unplug the PRI from the failed SBA, go and plug it in to the active SBA, and then run a script to rehome the users over to the secondary SBA. And it's not perfect, but it was a solution to meet the challenge of not being able to get hardware on site and not wanting to just have a cold standby server. At least this was warm and active and calls were flowing both directions so that if either one failed, we could just switch over to the other. Some of the SBA manufacturers, like Audio Codes has, the M3K has a HA option, but it doesn't have an SBA. It's just an SBC. So you can get HA from your PSTN connections, but that's the price and the capacity of that sort of pushes you more to your larger, above 1,000 seat kind of deployments. All of these slides will be available, so you'll be able to go through and read all of that in a great level of detail. So I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to speed up things. So I think you mentioned earlier around upstream deployments. So in terms of how we approach migrations and deploying gateways, there's a few different approaches. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So deploying the gateways upstream is whereby we unplug the PRIs from the existing PBX, plug them into a Sonos or an Audio Codes gateway, and then plug a T1 crossover pass-through from that gateway to the existing PBX. So then that gateway is just acting as a pass-through. It just passes the call through. The existing PBX doesn't know anything's happened. It thinks it's still talking to the carrier. Then that allows us to start routing calls off to Lync. And the gateway manufacturers now have the ability to do routing based on Active Directory so that you can say that, hey, if somebody's enabled for Lync voice, don't send that call to the PBX, send it straight over to Lync. So from a coexistence strategy, it's a nice strategy that you can slowly move users. The challenge is there's additional cost because you need extra PRI and line cards in the gateway, because if you've got one PRI in your existing PBXs, you need two PRI or line cards in that gateway because one in, one out. So it can be a little bit costly. So, yep.
Something to think about. What we do is we take those gateways, and as we migrate the sites, we rip the gateway out after we migrate. And that also pushes the customer along so they're not in that pilot.
Yep, and we have done that as well for some clients, rolled the SBA from one site to the next, but it adds complexity and cost and time. So we try to avoid that if possible, but it is an option to minimize the amount of hardware investment that you need to make.
One other thing too, if we leave the PBX upstream, we're using DSP resources on Avaya or Cisco, which is problematic. The PBX people don't like that.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
that offloads some of that off of the legacy.
So I used to do this strategy a lot. Now I've gone for the move PRIs and that hard cut over. I don't like to use the word hard or flash cut, but it's, pull the cables, move them over, because by doing that, you're forced to get it right. You're forced to do your testing, and it saves some of the money on the duplication of some of the hardware.
One
But
of the risk things that the customers like is, for whatever reason, something goes wrong, maybe just take the PRIs and plug it back into
exactly,
their legacy. And
yeah,
that gives them a comfort level.
exactly,
If
yeah.
I have to go back and take this stuff out, I just want to plug it.
It's all about finding the right risk profile and what's going to make sense, and it may be different per site, right? You may have one site where you rip cables and move them over. Your first site, you might decide, let's coexist so that we can test the waters and get that comfort level. This is my preferred method, and I say it's preferred because it doesn't cost anything. We don't have to buy extra line cards in a gateway. So, pre-migration, we've got the existing PBX talking to the PSTN, right? What we do is we come in, we drop in the, oh, my slide doesn't look right. Oh, my slide's wrong, I'm sorry. So what we would do is we're basically moving, this line here should be trashed. Because what we do is we pick up the PRIs from the PBX, move them into the gateway, and then the PBX is just not in the mix anymore. It's just a flash single migration event to move all of those services over. And as the gentleman up the back mentioned, once you move those cables over, that's when you do your testing before you start going and putting phones on desks and ripping out the old phones. So you get that set up, and when it's working, you say, okay, great, send the phone deployment guys out, and then start deploying the phones and ripping the old phones out. The good thing about this approach is, at this point, that PBX is already decommed, right? It's got no PRIs, so there's nothing still being used on there. So it's a good approach to force you to get to the end, to force you to get that PBX out of service. Yes, so audio codes, the question was about AD Aware SBA. So audio codes and Sonos have got Active Directory integration capabilities, whereby when a call comes in, they'll cache information from the AD or cache, depending upon what accent you're using.
So let's say a line URI, so there's an AD attribute that they query, so it actually queries Active Directory. They can tell whether the line, if that person's SIP enabled or not.
Yeah, and so if they're EV enabled, it will route them. You can set it up so that it will route them over to Lync rather than going to the PBX, so that it caches that so that it has the information and doesn't need to do a lookup. It's real time. It comes in, and before you know it, there's no extra delay in routing. The users don't notice anything. It's all really seamless, and it's a good coexistence migration strategy. Something really important is, what are you guys planning to use for monitoring and managing your Lync environment? And then, who's in here using System Center Operations Manager? Not enough. Are you guys using other tools like maybe BMC Patrol or Prognosis or any of those other tools, or are you just planning to not do any monitoring? All right, if you're planning to not do monitoring, please change that plan. You need something. It's, even if you just, like the audio codes and the Sonos gateways have at least got SNMP based alarms, at least do that. That's the very minimum. But System Center is probably the best because there's management packs out there for the gateways, for the servers. It's pre-configured with all of the alerts and the rules and things like that. It's a really, really, important element of, this is a voice system. Outages, downtime, poor quality. You need to get an alert saying, hey, there's been 5 poor quality calls before your users call you and say, hey, there's poor quality calls. Because then you can action that. And with SCOM, there's, the ability for it to run synthetic transactions and actually be testing it in the background and give you an alert and say, hey, between this site, there's some, network implications and issues. So make sure this is one, from an IT perspective, this is the most important things we can do to ensure success after the deployment. I mentioned call centers earlier, and I talked about the response group service within Lync. It's got some pretty cool features out of the box, but it's not a full functioning, contact center, call center solution. The key limitations are really around reporting, both real-time and historic. There isn't really anything. There's no supervisor capabilities. But one thing that about 12 or 18 months ago, there was a company out of Australia that came out with a product called Espera. And it's a client-side plugin, really, really good. I've got some clients that are using it, and I'm super happy with it. It's a client-side plugin that gives you the supervisor display, so that you can set up a wall board, gives you real-time reporting and historical reporting, and it's cheap. It's not as expensive as like a full-blown contact center. So if you've got some basic, again, when you do your site survey, you're going to know what your requirements are. If they're not advanced, then Aspera is a great solution. But then there's a number of leading vendors, and most of them are down here in the expo hall. They come at different price points. So when you know your requirements, you match those requirements to the solution, because some of them are built for big revenue-generating contact centers. And if you've just got your help desk queue and you just need a few little capabilities, you don't necessarily want to go for the the $600,000 or the $1 million solution there. Ooh, I got through on time. So does anybody have any questions? I know we've been pretty interactive. I've still got a few more Skype cards. I know that Rebecca did a great job of bribing you all with some Starbucks gift cards. So again, as I said, my green card application, which is almost finalized, is dependent upon some good scores here, so I'd really appreciate your feedback. Sure. Yep. So the question was, earlier we talked about people that needed user accounts and how did we solve it? There was no solution. We had to get accounts. We had to get the security team to approve that we would create some accounts for those users, because the business case was there that they had to have voicemail, and the only option, as I'm sure you know, with exchanges, if they need voicemail, they need to have a user account. It was very unfortunate. You've asked a lot of questions, so you're going to get my last one, and then we'll come to you. Sure. Yeah.
How do you get the people got up with the news that they're used to like picking up and calling? How you have to enter a PIN code? Is there any way around that?
Entering in a PIN code. So the question was, how do we get users to adapt? And that really comes down to the training and adoption piece. Getting the right training together and then getting people to that training is the key to success, because a lot of things are different, right? Lync is awesome, but it's awesome and different. So the way that people did things, it's all different. Transferring a call is different. Placing a call on hold, everything is different. So getting that training and adoption campaign and getting people to attend it is the key to success. And it's a challenge. It really is. Getting them there is the hardest part. Building the training and the collateral is easy, but getting the fire under their belly so that they attend is probably one of the hardest things. And that takes involvement. You've got to get the executive teams to help sponsor it and drive that attendance. Is there any way around logging onto the phones? Well, the phones need to be authenticated. So there isn't really a way around it. You can. It gets a little bit trickier as well when you're using the qualified devices, because and when you're using better together over Ethernet. When you use BTOE from Polycom, I haven't played a lot with the Snome one, but we've been doing a lot of rollouts with Polycom. It will actually, when you're tethered and the PC boots up and BTOE is enabled, it will actually pop up and ask the user to authenticate on the PC, and then that will authenticate the phone. So in that instance, they don't need to go and press anything on the phone. No, because it needs the password actually pressed into the PC to send it down to the phone. I don't know whether Polycom is working on that in future enhancement, but that's kind of the way that it works right now.
The site surveys that you do, kind of skill level for the
So, good question. So typically, for the interviews, you want someone that understands the system, right? Because the interview part is asking probing questions and then knowing how to interpret the results and then asking any follow-up questions. So we've created internal templates for everything. So we know the questions to ask. The actual walking around the floor, we generally use like a lower cost resource to drive down the cost, because it can take, to walk the floor and to mark off numbers and extensions, it's a laborious task. You're not going to get a Lync master wanting to go out and do that, right? He's going to shoot me if I try to send him out there. So we use what we call an L1 resource typically for the actual physical piece, but the interview stuff we'll use like a senior person, and then we'll have a senior person review the results to make sure that it all comes together, because there's a physical walking around, but then there's a comparison of that to the dumps from the PBX, mapping the call handlers and the auto attendants. So it's a bit of a mix, but the physical boots on the street piece, we use the lower cost resources. Sure.
The BT over Ethernet, does that work with the edge, or is it only?
Yes, it does. Because and I know this because I personally use BTOE to authenticate my phones from home, so it does work through the edge. Yeah. One issue though that I found with the Polycom phones is I don't know about the Snomes, but the Polycom phones don't support Exchange 2007 because there's a different version of ICE between 2007 and 2010, and I can't remember the ICE version numbers, but I ran into a client that had Exchange 2007 and the Polycom VVX phones would not work because of the ICE inconsistency. But the Edge stuff, it all works seamlessly. It's really, really nice.
You mentioned longer range. You guys capture, like VVX, polygons, CDR information. What do you do that?
So we don't do anything specific to capture the CDR data from the phones. We use a provisioning server. Like the Polycoms, the way that you set them up and deploy them is through a provisioning server because all of the settings have not moved to Lync yet. That's coming in a later release. So it's back to the old like Avaya and Cisco IPT days where you have config files that you can sort of push out settings. It's not that hard. Once you work it out, it's pretty easy. But then they'll have, on that provisioning server, you can set it up to log there. So when you're doing debug logging, you can have it send its central logs. But from a CDR perspective, we don't do anything special for that.
CDR also have to say about I think so.
Exactly, yeah. So we just leverage those.
Well, that's our problem. We do a lot of media bypass fees. That stuff doesn't go to the monitoring system.
Yeah. Challenge. Yeah. No, as I said, the qualified phones are still improving. There's, there's still a few limitations and challenges that, unfortunately, we're doing some big deployments with them, so we're running into them firsthand, unfortunately. But it's, Polycom's doing a good job. So is Snom in terms of closing the gap and getting these products ready. And I think as this year goes on, we're going to see them reach parity with the CX or the Lync Phone Edition devices, and then they'll move on to leaps and bounds ahead. It's not neat and clean yet. Is probably the best way to put it. It's still got some refinements. It's gotten a lot better in the early betas and alphas that we're working with. It was crashing machines and doing all sorts of terrible stuff. But the current build that we're using, we find to be stable, which is a good start, right? Especially when you're rolling that at scale. It's stable, but it's still not perfect in my opinion. And Polycom knows that, and so does Snom with their product. They know that there's improvement there to be had. So I think when I look at their roadmaps of Polycom and Snom, and I see sort of what they're looking at delivering over the rest of the calendar year, BTO enhancements is a key one of those as well. Any other questions, guys? Espera, E-S-P-R-A. The company name is Advatel. They're not actually here. I know that the CEO of the company is actually here, but they don't have a booth. But if you want, I can give you my card and you can shoot me an email and I can put you in touch with them. It's really cool. It's pretty cheap. And for that basic kind of, capability, it's really, really cool. And then the next one up, I found that Aspect is pretty well priced for the basic capabilities, and then the rest of them, they're all, they start to go up in price. But again, it depends upon what you're looking to do.
Yeah, I know that we use Aspera. It's really handy.
It is, isn't it?
If you're ever in the Lync response groups, if you get all the reporting and real-time data that you need.
Yeah. It's cool, yeah. Really cool. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate you guys hanging out and going through this. I'll hang around for a few minutes if anybody's got any questions. Otherwise, you can track us down at the Dimension Data booth downstairs.